Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight's program. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services at the Center for Jewish History. I would also like to thank the American Jewish Historical Society for co-sponsoring this event with us. If you'd like to sign up for any of the upcoming programs you just saw in the slideshow that was running before we started, you can please do that at the calendar of programs on our website, which is cjh.org. Tonight's program will last approximately 1 hour. As usual, the chat is disabled for participants, so please put your questions in the Q&A box. We will get to questions at the end, but you can type them in as we go along. Today's program is being recorded and will be available on the center's webpage and YouTube page. If you registered for the event, you will receive an email with a link to the recording as soon as it's available, though that may be a few weeks. When you registered, you should also have received a link to order a discounted copy of the book we're discussing tonight, 25% off plus free shipping, but we can put the link in the chat now and once again later during the program. All right, so let's jump right into it. I will introduce tonight's author. James Traub is a journalist and scholar specializing in international affairs. He is a columnist and contributor to the website foreignpolicy.com. He worked as a staff writer for The New Yorker from 1993 to 1998, and as a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine from 1998 to 2011. He has also written extensively about national politics, urban affairs, and education. His most recent book, which we'll be discussing tonight, is Judah Benjamin, Counselor to the Confederacy, a short biography in the Yale Jewish Lives series. Among his other books are What Was Liberalism?, John Quincy Adams' Militant Spirit, and The Best Intentions, a study of the UN under Kofi Annan. He is currently writing a biography of Hubert Humphrey. He teaches classes on American foreign policy and international affairs at New York University, including on its Abu Dhabi campus. He is a senior fellow of the Center on International Cooperation and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, James.
Hello, Lauren. I'm very happy to be here.
Great, so let's jump right into it. How did you come to write this book, and why did you and the publishers feel that this was the right time for a biography of Judah Benjamin?
Well, unfortunately, the birth story isn't particularly illuminating. The way the book happened is my friend Eileen Smith, who was the general editor of the Yale Jewish Lives series, as well as an editor at the publishing house Farrar Straus, asked me if I would like to write the book. Now, the reason she asked me is because she knew I had written a biography of John Quincy Adams, so she thought I'm a 19th century America person. And she thought that my take on this person would be interesting. Now, like most of us, I did not know very much about Judah Benjamin before. So what I did is I went to read what had already been written about him. And there is, I want to say for everyone's benefit, a very good biography of Judah, a long biography of Judah Benjamin by Eli Evans. And I read that and I thought, it's not that there's a need for another book like that. It's rather that this man's life was so compelling, but also mysterious, that the idea of spending, many months of my life learning about him and writing about him was very, very appealing. So I said yes.
Were you concerned at all about how to make his motivations compelling without sort of romanticizing him or making him too sympathetic, given his sort of morally compromised stance on many things?
Very much so. I mean, this is a really fundamental problem when you are dealing with a person who devoted himself to an evil ideology. There are two different mistakes you can make. One, and you find this in his earlier biographies, is you mitigate the horror of the ideology he devoted himself to in the name of fully humanizing him. The other would be to reduce such a book to a kind of forensic pathology. How could such an evil person have done such evil things? But both of these are psychologically primitive views. I mean, it is rare. The truly monstrous personality, the Hitler Stalin, is very rare. Most people who pursue terrible beliefs do so out of willful blindness, out of all sorts of stories that they manage to tell themselves. That's true today as it was true then. And so you have to find a way with a person like Judah Benjamin of giving him the full measure of his humanness without in any way reducing the horror of what he did. And so one of the questions you wind up confronting is, how could a person as intellectually gifted as he was have apparently unthinkingly thrown himself into a cause so evil? And that's a question I wrestle with in the course of the book.
Well, let's talk about how you actually did research for this book. You mentioned that there were other biographies, and I know you did some research at the Center for Jewish History in the American Jewish Historical Society's collection on Judah Benjamin. So what was that process?
Well, at the Center for Jewish History, one could find some of the very, very rare documents that come from this man. For example, there are several exchanges of letters, one involving a business transaction that he was engaged, which quite fascinatingly, he was part of a group that hoped to build a railroad across the Nicaraguan, not Panamanian isthmus, which obviously there are also letters between him and family members. I may have found some of those there too. I found some photographs of him, but the truth is, the record is very scanty. Probably the biggest part of the record is Judah Benjamin spent 4 years as a senior official in the Confederate government. And immediately after the Civil War, a big project was undertaken to compile all of the documents of the Union Army and of the Confederate government, I should say, the Union government and the Confederate government. And so there are preserved lots of correspondence from Judah Benjamin, but of personal things, of human things, of journals, of letters, there's virtually nothing. There's very little.
So let's go back to his early life. Tell us what you were able to find about his family background and early life and the Jewish community in Charleston in those years.
So Charleston had the biggest Jewish population in America in 1822, when the Benjamins moved there, which are still very small. There really wasn't a large Jewish population in the United States prior to 1850. They were scattered. So there was a thriving Jewish community, and especially in the South, in a few cities in the South, Charleston above all. And it was a population of people who were publishers. So there was a very important newspaper in Charleston that was published by a Jewish guy. They ran schools. They had philanthropic endeavors. They had their own synagogue, a very lovely synagogue. So it was a thriving community. They lived in a certain area around what is today King Street. That's where the Benjamin shop was. Interestingly, very close, 6 blocks, let's say, from where the grandees of Charleston lived, where the great lawyer politicians of Charleston lived. And so it's impossible not to imagine, I'll put it that way. It's not like we know it. It's impossible not to imagine that this young fellow, Judah Benjamin, this very brilliant, very ambitious young man with just fierce drive to get out of where he was, I'm sure he would have walked down the street and seen these beautiful mansions that were owned by people who had become lawyers and had become statesmen and had become great men, because it was a small, very compact city. And so the Jews, though they did live pretty much in one place, were very close to where the highest level of Christian Charleston was.
And his family was quite poor, though, correct?
His family was really unsuccessful. They had been in a number of places. They had started in the Caribbean. They had moved to North Carolina. They had moved again to Charleston. His father had a shop, and they sold dry goods like Jewish families everywhere throughout the 19th century. But they weren't very successful. They probably were always one step ahead of the collection agents of the time. So Judah really grew up with nothing. He grew up over the store. He appears to have grown up over the store. That appears to be the case. We're not totally sure of that. And the family probably had one slave when he was young. All families in the South of any means whatsoever had slaves, quite irrespective of whether they were Jewish or not. It wasn't really greater or lesser slave ownership among Jews than among Christians. He was able to go to a decent school only because he attracted the attention of the philanthropic Jewish community, who sent him to a good school and then ultimately sent him to Yale, which was unheard of, not only it was unheard of for Jews generally. He was the second Jew to have ever gone to Yale. The fact that he was this poor boy of no distinction whatsoever, and he was 14 years old when he went to Yale because he was this brilliant boy who just kept advancing through school very rapidly. And so it's astonishing to contemplate, but that's where he went.
So can you tell us what you know about his Yale years? Wasn't there some kind of scandal?
Yeah, Yale year, alas. He was there for about a year, and everybody who met him said, wow, this is the smartest guy here. I mean, literally, they thought he was the smartest person at Yale, and he was 14. And of course, by that time, some of the great prep schools in the country already existed. These were people who were coming from the best preparatory education in America. But this little boy seemed to remember everything he ever read and was a fantastic arguer and joined debating society. He tried very hard to be part of that world. I don't even know how much time he spent studying. He spent a lot of time, I think, studying. He wanted to, not studying books, studying people. He wanted to know, how do I become like them? How do I become this class of person? And so something happened. We don't know. He was told to leave. One of the clubs of which he was a member reported that he had stolen things and that they found things that had been stolen. Now, that report itself is somewhat shadowy. It was resurrected in 1861 when Judah Benjamin was a Confederate officer by someone who said he was a classmate of his almost 37 or something years earlier. Maybe true, maybe not true. Judah Benjamin said he was asked to leave because he couldn't afford tuition, but that's almost certainly not true because he wrote a kind of groveling letter of apology to the dean. And you don't do that if you've been kicked out because you don't have the money. He did something bad, but we don't know what.
Okay, well, after that, after getting kicked out, he managed to be an extremely successful attorney everywhere he went. So what do you think was the source of that success? And was he hindered by being Jewish?
No, he wasn't hindered by being kicked out of Yale, and he wasn't hindered by being Jewish. He just was the biggest Yiddisher cup anybody ever met. He was just smart and ambitious. I mean, he had a burning desire to succeed. And so he went to New Orleans at age 17 or 18, knew nobody, had nothing, found a couple jobs, got a job tutoring, met a beautiful girl, classic Shiksa goddess, Creole girl, 16 years old, beautiful, spoiled. And they got married. And neither one they knew what they were doing. It was a terrible idea. They were very poorly suited, but they got married. And this fellow then becomes a lawyer by the time he's 21 or 22. Remember, in those days, you didn't go to law school. You simply apprenticed yourself, which he did. He started practicing. He very quickly made friends with local kingmakers in New Orleans. Wrote a book of basically kind of a compilation of statutes in Louisiana. Quickly attracted a very important commercial practice, especially in things like marine insurance. And by the middle of the 1840s, when he was 32, 33 years old, he was widely known to be one of the senior members of the New Orleans bar and a very important citizen in town.
So he wasn't held back by his Jewishness, but we should say he wasn't actively practicing Judaism, correct? He was
right. But see, New Orleans was a brilliant idea on his part. Again, we don't know why he chose it, but it was a great idea. It was if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere town of 1830. And it may be, this is a speculation on my part, New Orleans had a very, very complicated racial hierarchy because it had a very large number of free blacks. And there was a very elaborate racial classification in New Orleans. If you were all white, all black, or any number of infinite gradations in between. Therefore, a Jew was white. That was the thing. A Jew was not any part of that gradation. He or she was white. And so it may be that that kind of honorary whiteness helped. But certainly it was a place that was totally open to ambition. It was a city that was growing in leaps and bounds. Its ancient ruling class was becoming more and more marginal. A new commercial ruling class was coming to dominate in the third and fourth and fifth decades of the 19th century. And so if you were successful, if you could do what you did well, you would make it. And ultimately, Judah Benjamin so made it that he was the first Jew to be admitted into what was called the Boston Club. And that was not named after the city, but there was a card game, kind of like poker, called Boston. And Judah Benjamin was a great card player. He was a gambler. There was a kind of controlled recklessness about him. He was a very good card player, so he was admitted, which is, a great social achievement for him.
And you say he was sort of play acting the role of a Southern gentleman.
Well, he took that to what we now see was an appalling level, because in order to really be a Southern gentleman, in his mind, certainly, you had to be a property owner. You had to be a plantation owner. And so this was something very few Jews did. And the other wealthy Jews in New Orleans moved into a big house in one of the new neighborhoods in town, or stayed in one of the beautiful houses in the Vieux Carré. Judah Benjamin alone among them bought a plantation. It was called Bellechasse. He bought it in 1844, and it was a sugar plantation. And he became a plantation owner. What this meant is, of course, he had slaves. He had 140 slaves. And from my research, so far as I've been, I only found someone, the second largest slave owner among Jews had somewhere in the 40s. Judah Benjamin had maybe 3 times more slaves than any other Jewish American, a sickening achievement. And not only that, it's even worse than that. Sugar, and again, I spent a fair amount of time learning about this. Sugar was a killing crop. It required an intensity of cultivation. And also because the manufacturing had to be done on site, because otherwise the sugar cane would lose its sugar, it would lose its potency. So it had to be processed in a frenzied 2 or 3 week period. And this was the combination of the intense heat of the area and the violence of the work killed people. And when slaves in, let's say, Virginia were told they were going to be sent to Louisiana, there was a famous case of a slave rebellion. Not that they were rebelling against servitude. They were rebelling against what they thought was the death sentence of going to a sugar plantation. So that's how horrible it was. And we don't know anything about Judah Benjamin's inner thoughts, but it is hard to imagine that he did not go to the slave pens of New Orleans and buy slaves, which meant that he was looking at a family. He was looking at a mother and children and saying, I'll take that one and that one.
So can you talk about what you know, if anything, about his attitude toward slavery over his lifetime and how he justified his defense of it?
Well, so this is in a way the question of questions. And because he was a lawyer and a very gifted lawyer and an advocate, he was capable of making an argument entirely against his own beliefs. And there was one of the more famous escaped slave cases called the McCargo case, because that was the name of the insurance company that he was defending. He had to make the argument that the slaves who had escaped from the ship called the Creole had ceased to be the cargo of the ship because they had freed themselves by they basically went to a British Caribbean island where slavery was no longer legal. And in order to make that argument, he made the argument that slavery was an unnatural act that could only exist where so-called positive law, specific law said it is right. And he said, otherwise, it is unnatural. And he then gave a speech that sounded like it came from Shylock's speech in The Merchant of Venice, hath not a Jew eyes. It's a beautiful, moving speech, which he didn't believe. But he needed his client. He needed to say it for his client. And yet it's impossible to read this and think, oh, this man probably had the exact same attitudes as all Southerners, that he thought Black people were subhuman. They were chattel. And so you can't know. But what we know is that he lived in New Orleans, a place where Black people did every single thing white people did. The person who sold him the very advanced technology that he used on his plantation was a freed Black man. Could he have really completely bought into the Southern idea that slaves weren't, that Black people weren't human? I find that hard to believe. And yet at the same time, I also know that he was incapable of holding a belief that would get in the way of his own ambitions. And if he had believed that slaves were fully human, he would not have been able to do what he did. Of course, he wouldn't have been able to be a senior official in the Confederacy. Ergo, whatever his instincts might have told him, whatever his knowledge of the world might have told him, he chose to put that out of his mind. And he did so.
So just largely motivated by ambition and self-interest.
Let's be a little bit more complicated. I mean, yes, ambition and self-interest, but having completely bought into a certain identity. He loved the South. That's what he was. He was a Southerner, far more, by the way, than a Jew. He was a Southerner. He was raised in the South. He believed in the South. He viewed himself as a man of the South. And therefore, he had the beliefs that went along with being a man of the South. And so it was so deeply integrated into his identity that it's very hard to sort of pull pieces apart and imagine that he could have been everything that he was, and yet also have been honest with himself about slavery.
So let's talk a little bit about his own personal and family life. Can you tell us why he was dogged by rumors throughout his life that he was gay?
Yeah, possibly because he was. I mean, I think he was, but because we know so little about his life, it's very hard to say. Okay, so here's the reason for the belief. He got married very young to this beautiful young Catholic girl, and then they didn't have children for 10 years, which was unheard of. Then they finally had a child, Ninette, little girl. And when Ninette was 1, Nathalie Saint-Martin, his wife, announced to him that she and Ninette were leaving for Paris. She wasn't divorcing him. She was leaving for Paris, where she'd never been. Well, for any Southern man, I mean, for any man at the time, but for a Southern man, this was an unimaginable blow to his honor. And he would have been expected to beat her, to turn upon her, to cast her out from his life. But he didn't. He didn't. He went to visit them every year and paid for their upkeep. And what was really shocking to New Orleans is he didn't take a mistress. Now, in New Orleans, it was completely normal for married men to take a mistress. There was an entire social system called plaçage, in which a quadroon woman, a woman 1/4 Black, would be placée as a mistress, with a man who had a wife somewhere in the back of the house, while the mistress was there like a geisha, being charming and beautiful and entertaining in the front of the house at a party. Judah Benjamin, who of course had every reason to have a mistress, his wife was gone and had abandoned him, never did. He was a very elegant, charming person who was seen as effeminate. He was a gourmet. He loved to give parties. He loved to tell elaborate stories and play games. He was enormously fond of his little nephews, of his sister, of his mother. He thrived in female company. He had a very intimate, almost strange relationship with Natalie's much younger brother, whom he brought with him to Richmond in the Confederate government and they roomed together, and people found the relationship between them very strange. And so these rumors dogged him from New Orleans, and they came with him to Washington, and they followed him to Richmond, where the Confederate government was established.
So can you talk a little about how he did get involved in politics, his career trajectory?
So he ran for Senate in Louisiana as a Whig, because men like him, men of substance, tended not to join the Democratic Party, which even then was a states' rights party, and he had a real national vision. He was a Whig. He was sent to Washington. And by 1856 or so, there's very little going on except debate over slavery. That's everything. And he, who was an enormously eloquent person, becomes a champion of slavery and the Southern cause, and is looked upon in the South not as a great legislator, but as a great spokesman for the cause, and delivers several famous speeches opposing various compromises of the day that might have avoided civil war, or so it was thought at the time. And so when Lincoln is elected and Southern states begin, starting with South Carolina in December of 1860, to secede, Louisiana secedes in January of 1861. Judah Benjamin delivers a farewell address, which would be recited by little boys in the South for generations to come. And he leaves, and then he is asked by Jefferson Davis to come to Mobile, where at first the Confederate government formed. And then when Virginia joins the Confederacy, the government moves to Richmond, and Judah Benjamin moves with them.
And wasn't he also asked to join the Supreme Court at one point?
Yes. So back in the 1850s, he was the first Jew to ever be asked to join the Supreme Court. But if he had done that, he was already practicing. He had a huge, thriving law practice. This man was making $40,000 or $50,000 a year at a time when that would have been the equivalent of a couple of $1 million a year. So he said no to that. He was asked to be ambassador to a number of countries, Spain chief among them. He said no to that. Also, he would have been the first Jewish American ambassador. So he was a trailblazer in all those ways. He was technically maybe not the first Jewish senator, but the other one, Senator Yulee from Florida, regarded himself as a Christian, had not formally converted, so it's unclear, what we should call him.
So you say he wasn't hindered by his Jewishness in his legal career. How about in his, obviously he reached to the greatest heights in his political career, but how did it affect how people saw him or reacted to him? Then
you needed a scapegoat. So once he was occupying a public position in the South, this outsider was suddenly a very convenient figure whenever things went wrong. And he was doubly an outsider because he was also seen as not an ideal of Southern manhood. He was seen as not fully a man. And he's the Secretary of War. That means that he is giving instructions to the true ideals of Southern manhood. P.T.L. Beauregard, Stonewall Jackson, Joseph Johnston. These are the heroes of the South. And this short, pink-faced Jewish man who barely knows how to sit a horse is telling them what to do. So they, the generals, who were, I have to say, if you read their correspondence, you think these guys were so much more taken up with their own personal sense of honor than with the cause they were defending. They would have been impossible for anybody to instruct because they were prepared to quit at a drop of a hat because they haven't been given total support and it was a violation of their honor and they'd had it. And Judah Benjamin had to keep them fighting. And so he had to basically tell them no. Well, it was Jefferson Davis who was saying that. Judah Benjamin was his cutout. And he needed Judah Benjamin for that because he didn't want to be the one who was saying no. And he knew that Judah Benjamin, who depended on him utterly, would never do that. Judah Benjamin was the court Jew of the Confederacy. And so he was prepared to tell the bad news to these generals, or just take the blame for things that the lack of ammunition. They couldn't say, I can't send you a cannon because we don't have any cannons. I can't send you guns because we don't have any guns. I can't send you men because we have no men. And so he was increasingly hated. And the anti-Semitic bile that had been just below the surface now erupted. And as the Southern economy, the economy of Richmond, began to fail, there were accusations of price gouging because prices shot up. Everything became unaffordable. Well, there were some Jewish merchants in Richmond. And so Judah Benjamin, the Jew, was associated with these Jewish price gouging merchants. And so, yes, he was subject to all this attack, but Jefferson Davis always had his back. And so whatever happened, whoever said anything, Judah Benjamin knew that Jefferson Davis would always defend him, and he always did.
And what was the history of that friendship with Jefferson Davis?
Very strange, very strange. They met in the Senate, and their first interaction we know about should have been the last one. It was some debate, not clear what. It had to do with weaponry. And Judah Benjamin said something that Jefferson Davis, as a career military man, took exception to, some minor detail that maybe Benjamin got wrong. And so Jefferson publicly and quite harshly corrected him. And they had a fight right there on the floor of the Senate. And it turned into a challenge. And Judah Benjamin challenged Jefferson Davis. Now, that's like Alexander Hamilton challenging Aaron Burr, a suicidal act. Jefferson Davis would have slaughtered him. And for the only time in his life, Jefferson Davis said, I was wrong. And withdrew, asked Benjamin to withdraw the challenge in the face of his absolutely explicit apology. That was the basis of their friendship. Jefferson Davis saw that this man, whom he had contempt for as a rich lawyer and a Jew, actually had incredible moxie. He'd stood up to him. And so they became friends, and Jefferson Davis could not operate without him. Davis was an austere, suffering, stoical, martial figure. Judah Benjamin was whistling a happy tune. Judah Benjamin, no matter what was happening, no matter how terrible things were, had a joke on his lips and a compliment for the ladies, and he was always cheerful. He knew how to put that face on. When everything was going to hell, Judah Benjamin made it seem like, don't worry, everything is fine. And nobody worked as hard as he did. Nobody could run things as well as he did. Jefferson Davis, could not live without this man.
Sort of that attitude you talk about was really on display in how you describe his post-war escape to England. So you want to talk about that story?
Oh yes, this is an epic. It's an epic story. And I say in the book, because I want to go back to your first question about how you write about such a man. I say he didn't have Christian virtues, but he did have classical virtues. He had the kind of virtues you associate with Ulysses. He had pluck, he had canniness. He knew how to put on a disguise. He knew how to be what he needed to be. And so at the very end, in April of 1865, when Richmond fell, that's April 2nd, and the Confederacy, the Confederate government retreats. By the way, the Confederacy doesn't surrender. Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox, but Davis doesn't surrender. The Confederacy still lives. And so they retreat further south. And people are peeling away. People are making up excuses. They're getting sick. This and that's happening. Judah Benjamin stays. And he says, we have to fight. And Jefferson Davis thinks, thank God I've got Judah Benjamin with me. Little knowing that Benjamin has decided when the moment comes, I'm leaving. And so when they get far enough south, they've just crossed into northern Georgia, Judah Benjamin says, my friend, I am leaving, but I'm going to the Caribbean where I know we have money. I'm going to get gold. And then I'm going to meet you because Jefferson Davis is going to go to Texas and reestablish the Confederacy in his crazed mind. So they go this way. Judah Benjamin teams up with another New Orleans Jewish lawyer who was among the group. And that man claims to be his translator. Judah Benjamin pretends to be an itinerant French businessman who's going around the South looking for land to buy. And he puts on little glasses and he changes his hair and he changes his clothing and he only speaks French. His French was quite perfect. So they do this for days and they're sleeping on the ground. They're eating hardtack. They're eating anything they can eat. And then Judah Benjamin says to his friend, okay, it's too dangerous for you. I want you to go home. I'm going to go on by myself. And he goes on by himself and he somehow finds his way to the west coast of Florida, where he pays much of the money he has left with him, gold sewn into his coat, to two men to take him in a boat all the way down the coast of Florida, because he knows if he reaches the Caribbean islands, he can get a boat to England. So many things happen. This is his little version of the Odyssey, where they're challenged by a Union gunboat and he pretends to be the cook on the ship. And the captain of the ship says, I've never seen a Jew doing such a terrible job. And they continue on. They face water spouts that look like they're going to destroy their little delicate craft, and it doesn't. They put in finally at Bimini. He then gets on a boat. The boat sinks. He goes back. He gets caught in a storm. And then finally, he reaches England. And he writes later in a letter to one of his friends, he said, you know, I was exposed at sea for days with the sun beating down and it looks like I was going to die. And, you know, I never had a moment of indisposition. And that temperament, that astonishing temperament, saw him through. It's quite a remarkable story.
Then he creates a whole new successful life for himself in London.
Yeah. I mean, you know, God should have struck him down, but that's not life. That's the movies. Instead, he goes to the Inns of Court, where normally you spend 3 years basically having lunch, serving your time, and then they'll make you a lawyer. And after 6 months, everyone said, this man is more brilliant than anybody else around. He's already suited to be a lawyer. Let's just end the charade and make him a lawyer, which they do. Within 3 years, he is one of the most prominent members of the London bar. He has written by himself a 1,000-page textbook on the law of sales called Benjamin on Sales, which for the next half century in England and in the United States is considered an indispensable text. He rises up higher and higher in the legal profession until when he retires in 1883, he is considered one of the great men of the English bar. And he dies full of honors, reunited with wife and daughter and son-in-law in the beautiful Hôtel Particulier that he has built in Paris.
So were there no negative repercussions for him for having represented the Confederacy?
None. And when I think about this, I think this is where this shape-shifting, this assimilatory gift that he had stood him in such good stead. Because the English recognized a gentleman. And for someone like Judah Benjamin, who had succeeded in the ranks of the gentlemen in the South, London was the ultimate thing that all of those people aimed for. That was true civilization. And so when he found himself in that civilized world, he blended in perfectly. So no, he suffered not at all either from being a Jew or from having been a champion of this evil cause, not in the least.
And how was he viewed in the South after the Civil War?
Oh, they very negatively. So certainly among the dead enders, everybody else, all the other senior figures had been brought to book. Some had been imprisoned. Some had been, and Jefferson Davis in the end was tried. He was granted clemency by Andrew Johnson before he came to trial. The trial got delayed for many years, and then he was pardoned. Others were imprisoned. Others died. And there's Judah Benjamin having this lovely life in England. And so now new rumors came to the fore. It was claimed that he had stolen gold that had been sent ahead to London. And there is no evidence of that. What is true is that he had the foresight to send as much as $100,000 worth of cotton to England, and which he then sold and got the money. However, the bank in which he deposited the money went bust about a year later, 2 years later, and he lost it all. And so that was not even ill-gotten gains. And in any case, he lost that. So whatever wealth he had was wealth he gained himself.
So what do you think his legacy should be today?
You know, it's a hard question. In some ways, he leaves almost nothing behind. There's no family members.
So he has no descendants.
There's no descendants. There are no monuments. There's very little memory. And so leaves behind, in a way, means something more like, you know, what do we make of him today? What do we think his significance is today? And so, you know, one level, he is a story about this great American act of assimilation. Here is this poor boy with nothing, and he's Jewish. And by this astonishing combination of gifts, he raises himself to the highest level. And yet, here's the kind of, I would say, tragic irony, except he didn't suffer the tragedy. He assimilated into something evil. You can imagine if his family had moved to Massachusetts, he would have become a Daniel Webster figure. He would have been the perfect Massachusetts gentleman who would have been a heroic defender of the Union against the South. But that's not what happened to him. He became a perfect Southerner and therefore a plantation owner and a defender of slavery. And so we can only regard him with the horror that's due to all that.
All right, well, I think that's a good segue into some questions from the viewers. We have a question from Linda that he's buried in a Catholic cemetery in Paris. Is there any evidence that he ever converted to the Catholic faith?
No, but I mean, there's a story behind that. So he's buried in Père Lachaise, you know, which is the right place to be buried in Paris if you're haute bourgeoisie. And he's buried in the plot that belonged to the family that his daughter married into, which was a good military family. But the story behind that is that Natalie Saint-Martin, who he married, obviously could not bear the fact that he was Jewish. She always addressed him as Philippe. His name was Judah Philip Benjamin. Nobody called him Philip. She called him Philippe to make him a Frenchman and a Catholic. And as he lay dying, she called a priest to administer extreme unction. Now, Judah Benjamin was utterly indifferent to his own religion, but he did not convert. He did not convert. And unlike the other Benjamin of the day, Disraeli, who did convert, and we don't know why. Did he not convert because there was no point in converting if your name is Judah Benjamin and you've got thick, black, dark, curly hair and black eyes? Maybe. Did he not convert because that to him was an affirmative act of repudiation, which he would not do? So he hesitated? I don't know. We can't know.
On page 163 of your book, you write that Benjamin was charged with treason in May 1866. I find no record of an indictment or record of this charge. What was your source for this?
Well, he was, it's a good question, and not having that immediately in front of me, I cannot say whether there was a legal filing of treason. Yes, I can, though, in fact. There were he and a group of other senior Confederate officials, not he individually, he and a group were all charged with treason. And what happened to those charges, once Andrew Johnson had settled in as president, is that over time, they were dismissed. Now, that charge was way over Judah Benjamin's head for some number of years, and he would cite that as, why can I not go back to New Orleans? I assume that at some point the charge against him was dismissed, though a good question as to whether or not it was or never was. But it was part of a group charge, let's say.
Are you familiar with Dara Horn's fiction, All Other Nights, which uses him as a character in her novel?
Yeah, I have seen it. And I've seen it. I mean, I own the book. It's not a great work of literature, but she clearly had read the two earlier biographies by Pierce Butler and a man named Walter Duthot. I mean, it's interesting that he was chosen, for this role, but it's not exactly a deathless work of literature.
A question, what was the name of his plantation and was it located in New Orleans proper?
Yeah, so the answer is it was called Belchas. And Belchas was on a crook in the Mississippi River, just south of New Orleans. And so it's in its own parish, which at that time was not part of New Orleans. Now, I believe it is Belchas Parish of New Orleans, but that's of a later date.
I don't know if you can answer this, but what did other Southern Jews think about Benjamin?
That's an interesting question, and it's not very easy to answer because, we don't have a lot of records of that. Certainly, there are, two or three other there are a number of other prominent Southern Jews in the Confederate Army, though nothing like Benjamin, and certainly they form a little unit. But there are, I can't even think of extensive accounts by Jews about Benjamin. It is hard to believe that he was not a source of great pride, because even though we would not like to think it, it is a fact that there was no such thing as Southern Jewish opposition to slavery and the Confederacy. Of course, there must have been privately. And a gentleman named Philip, who is a kind of a little bit of a doppelganger of Judah Benjamin, thought that there was a mistake to break away from the Union, though he certainly didn't repudiate slavery. So the fact is, he was by far the most important of the many Jews who in some form or other served the Confederacy.
What relationship in England did he have, if any, with Benjamin Disraeli?
This is in the movie version, in the fictionalized movie version, there would be a scene with Disraeli. My guess is that soon after he arrived, when he was being introduced around, it would be surprising if he didn't meet Disraeli. Disraeli never notes having met Judah Benjamin, and Judah Benjamin, alas, doesn't note anything for our purposes. So it would be odd if they haven't met, but we know nothing about their thoughts about each other.
A question, I thought Benjamin burned his letters. How many have survived?
Well, so he burned the letters he received, but that's different from the letters he sent.
Right.
So that's what we have. So when I spoke earlier about those letters, the Hargis letters, which are about this business transaction, they exist because he sent all these letters to his business confederates. The letters that we have to his sister, one of his sisters, Penny, she kept those as well. And so we have those too. And so thank God, we have that much, because outside of a two-part series that he wrote about sugar plantation farming, which he meant to deliver as a lecture in person, but he couldn't. That's kind of all we have from his own hand.
We have a comment from an AJHS archivist. AJHS, that's the American Jewish Historical Society, has a collection of correspondence with Peter Hargis regarding the Louisiana Tehuantepec Company in 1857, which you spoke a bit about. Do you have any insight into this, his involvement in this endeavor, which bankrupted the Hargis family? And also we could put the link to the finding aid to that collection back in the chat again.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, so one of the things that I found in reading these letters was the incredible amount of work that lay underneath this Southern gentility of Benjamin's. He was working every angle. In Washington, he was talking to President Buchanan. He was talking to the State Department. He was wooing investors. He was traveling down really to Mexico, not Nicaragua. He wasn't surveying the site. He was getting legal permission. There were a series of competing claims, and he was trying to defeat the other claims. He did everything for this. Initially, he was a major shareholder, and then he agreed to sacrifice portions of his share, though he was going to take a very large legal fee in order to bring in other investors and make sure they had a sizable interest. So here was this dynamo who was personally keeping this whole thing afloat. Now, it is probably the case that if they ever really had a chance to survey this territory, what they knew about was the Atlantic and the Pacific terminus of this path. They didn't understand how incredibly dense the jungle was in between the two. And so there's a reason why we didn't build a railroad or a highway across that part of the isthmus, but instead built a canal. So it never might have worked. Judah Benjamin was working on this right up to the beginning of the Civil War. And he appears to have left behind him in Richmond a thing that was later discovered, which was a strong box with Confederate money and other documents, including his shares in that railway, which clearly when he was fleeing, he realized no point in taking them with me. They're never going to be worth anything.
You said that Benjamin was a lover of the South. Did he come to love England during his final years? Did he try to become an Englishman?
He was accused by angry Southerners of trying to become an Englishman. You said that you would live and die for our cause. And what did you do? You escaped, you went to England, and just like you chameleon-like became one of us, so chameleon-like you became one of them. Now, Judah Benjamin would have said, what's the contradiction here? These are two societies based on civilized values, both, of course, extremely hierarchical. The aristocracy of the South was a racial aristocracy. The aristocracy of England was a class aristocracy. He was extremely comfortable in both. So I think he would have said that, I mean, he could have settled in Paris if he wanted to, and a number of his friends in Paris asked him to do so, but he felt that he would be better off in England, and perhaps it was because he found English society more congenial. And also, by the way, perhaps because he knew that slavery in the best society, best circles in Paris, slavery was universally despised as a monstrous evil.
And what happened to his property and slaves in the US?
So what happened was there was a terrible flood which destroyed the value of his property. And the only way that he could escape bankruptcy was by selling that property. And so he sold it and reestablished himself. And so that was the end. I mean, it looked like a kind of a catastrophe for him. And it might have been a catastrophe for somebody else. But he took a small place in town, and lived there instead. And went on with life, and just, he didn't look back. That wasn't his nature.
So is anything known about his brother and other siblings?
His sisters lived for quite a while. He remained very close to his sisters. He wrote them letters, and a number of them survived him by decades. And since they had, some of them, a few of them had boys, though, as I say, he had no issue, the family did. Now, I actually did not trace the lineage of his nephews, so I couldn't tell you what became of them.
This question says, I read that Benjamin was negotiating with the British to enter the war on the side of the Confederacy. Assuming the South won the Battle of Gettysburg, was that a possibility?
Yeah, I mean, as a counterfactual, Gettysburg was still relatively early on in these negotiations. And so the answer is that from the point of view of the British government, which was very sympathetic to the Southern cause, and this was a Tory government. But even Gladstone, the liberal, was also, I find it kind of hard to understand. Gladstone was quite sympathetic to the slave South. And so it's not that the British government had a moral problem with slavery, no, or a moral problem with the South. No, it's that they thought, we will not take the risk of backing what we think is the losing side. And so Charles Francis Adams, who was the United States ambassador in England, made it very clear that, and William Seward, the Secretary of State, made it very clear that if England recognized the South, the United States would view England as a declared enemy and claim that it would widen its war to include England. Who knows what that would have meant? Presumably they would have tried to seize Canada, as we had in the War of 1812. And so the price was very high. And there were two figures. There was the French and the English. And Benjamin realized early on that England was going to be almost impossible unless there were tremendous successes in the battlefield that really that gave support to his persistent claim that the North was failing, the South was rising, and the South was going to win. And so you should recognize us now while you'll still get the advantage of doing so. Didn't work. The French dallied with the South much more, even though French public opinion was more anti-slavery. And so Benjamin believed right up through sometime in 1864 that he might be able to get the French on his side, but it was never possible. The French would never move without the English. And so the actual variable was always England. I think also Benjamin thought cotton is king. The English cannot live without Southern cotton. And he was wrong. Cotton was less central to the English economy than he thought. And India and Egypt had begun producing cotton that they could turn to instead.
I thought there is one statue of him that was paid for in part by the Jewish community of South Carolina. Do you know of that?
No, in North Carolina. So not even a statue. There was a little plaque, and I mentioned this in the book, in Charlotte, because when the Confederacy retreated, they retreated through Charlotte, and Benjamin stayed at the home of a prominent local Jewish family. And so synagogues in Charlotte paid for a plaque that said Judah Benjamin. I think the house was gone, but the plaque remained on the site, where Judah Benjamin had stayed. And only in recent years did people say, well, why are we memorializing this slave owner? And so the plaque was removed.
There are a couple of questions about other biographies, the one by Pierce Butler and Eli Evans. Would you feel they were overly sympathetic, or why did you feel a new treatment was needed?
Well, okay, so as I mentioned, I think at the outset, the Eli Evans biography is an admirable biography. And as I also, I think, said at the outset, the purpose of the Yale Jewish Lives series is never to supersede existing biographies. It's rather to cast a new light on a character and to try to bring out a new truth about a character. I wasn't going to spend 10 years writing a book. The whole point is it's a short book. So it's in no way a judgment on the quality of the Eli Evans biography that I wrote this book. The earlier books are too sympathetic. The first one by Pierce Butler, written in 1906, Pierce Butler was a Southerner of a great South Carolina family. His ancestor had signed the Declaration of Independence. His family was a great plantation owning family. He's got lots to say about Benjamin as a plantation owner, but he can barely be troubled to condemn slavery. The second biography by Duthot doesn't quite have that problem, but it does have painful moments when the author says things like, if only we had more men like Judah Benjamin who could have spoken both to the South and the North, perhaps we could have avoided the Civil War, which is a preposterous thought.
Can you speak a little bit about his relationship with Verena Howell Davis?
Yeah, I'm so glad somebody asked that question. So this is in many ways the most interesting relationship of his life. Verena Howell. So Jefferson Davis marries relatively young, loses his wife tragically, grieves for years, and then meets this quite extraordinary young woman, Verena Howell, who's half terrified by this figure, but also deeply taken by it. And so she's 17, he's 35, they get married, but he's not someone she can, very easily relate to. And along comes Jefferson Davis, this charming man, sensitive, amusing, a wonderful conversationalist, and they have an incredibly close relationship. I mean, sometimes you do feel like she loved him. She really loved him. Certainly, she didn't get a whole lot of solace from this flinty character she married, and she got a lot from Judah Benjamin. She doesn't seem to have recognized the thought that he was gay. She thought his relationship with Jules, his young brother-in-law, was odd, but she doesn't say more than that. But we know a lot about Judah Benjamin because Verena Howell, late in life, writes a series of letters to a man named Francis Lawler, who wanted to be a Judah Benjamin biographer, but Judah Benjamin said, I don't have anything for you. And so the biography never came to be. But those letters are very, very telling about Judah Benjamin.
Well, we've gone over, so let's take one more question. But before we stop, let's put the link to the book, to purchase the book again in the chat, as well as a link to a very short multiple choice survey about the program that helps us plan future programs. So this question says, I find it interesting that Judah Benjamin is never mentioned in the Ken Burns Civil War series, even though we know that JP had quite a high position in the Confederacy. Why do you think that is? Because he was Jewish?
I have nothing to say about that. First, I haven't seen the series, but even if I had, it's a terrible mistake to try to speculate about why a thing that isn't there isn't there. So I don't know.
Okay. Well, thank you all for watching and for your thoughtful questions. Please click into that quick survey. And thank you very much, James, for taking this hour with us. And I highly recommend the book to everyone watching.
Well, Lauren, thank you very much. You really put me to my test here with these questions, and I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.